October 14th is a memorable day in some parts of the world. We are going to have an annual solar eclipse. Now, the definition of a solar eclipse, as you would know, is the moon coming in line of the sun and the earth. And when it comes in such a way that it blocks the sun for most part, then a beautiful ring is created. Hence, the October 14th eclipse is also called the Ring of Fire. The other eclipse, again many of you know, is when the earth blocks the moon and the sun. And that eclipse is a lunar eclipse. We will have that on October 28th in some parts of the world. Now, eclipses are a fascinating cosmic dance with the magnificence of divinity at work. You could say the nature is at its best when the sun, earth and the moon are in a certain position and they exert their influence of visibility on one another. And when one blocks the visibility of the other, an eclipse occurs. An eclipse is a treat to the eye. But to be transparent, I have not enjoyed much of this visual treat. Right through my childhood and growing up years, the traditional belief and restrictions have overshadowed, I may say, the shadows of the moon and the earth. My experience is not unique. In many Hindu households, when we talk of an eclipse, there are a series of beliefs and restrictions associated. The belief and restrictions, however, are not universal. I distinctly remember while our family had a set of restrictions, there were many others who went about life in a regular way. As a simple example, there were restrictions in our household on eating during an eclipse, yet many restaurants run by even strict traditional believers used to be kept open. And it was business as usual for them. From an inquisitive mind of mine, it raised many questions. Not to disprove the belief or challenge the restrictions, but prompting me over the years to look at the eclipse from a Gita and an Upanishadic perspective and go deeper into the belief and restrictions. In the pursuit of inquiry, I explored many of the common beliefs. Now let me just list the 4 most common Hindu traditional ones related to an eclipse. Number 1, making sure that you're not eating any stale or stored food. During an eclipse, you're asked to throw away whatever is cooked, prepared, and you're asked to make fresh food the next day. Number 2, you're asked to take bath before the eclipse and after the eclipse. Number 3, if you're pregnant, you're strongly advised not to come out of the house and stay in a dark room where there is no speck of light entering through the doors or windows. Number 4, you're asked to offer more prayers, more pujas, do more charities. I know there is a lot more than these 4 beliefs, but these 4 are the most common that you would have heard. Now let's look at these beliefs from a scriptural and scientific aspect. Let me start with the scriptures. In the scriptures, particularly in the Rig Veda, a rishi or Rishi Atri describes the process of an eclipse. In Canto 5, there's a series of verses dedicated to it. The rishi clearly talks about the sequence of how the eclipse happens. Moon coming in between the sun and the earth, the sun being covered, and then there is a release state. It starts with a partial release and then there is a full release. There isn't any detailed description of the why or the effects of the eclipse in the scriptures. The process or the sequence of an eclipse is where the emphasis is. And that was the extent of it. Then we have the mythological stories in the Hindu scriptures describing eclipses during a war being used as an auxiliary weapon to create a situation that puts the enemy or the evil at a disadvantage and help the righteous win over the evil. These mythological stories are good to listen and probably good to help inculcate children into some kind of a faith. Now, these beliefs have emerged over thousands of years, as you could imagine, through repeated observations of patterns, particularly focusing on the impacts on human beings, animals, and nature. They were observed and closely mapped to the states described by Rishi Atri in the Rig Vedas, and a conclusive opinion was formed about these impacts. These conclusive opinions, we follow them even today as traditional restrictions. That's all fine, but on the path of spirituality, we need to go deeper. In the matters of eclipse, that is where we look at the scientific aspect. And through that, we try to explain some of these traditional beliefs. In the scientific experiments performed over time, there are two theories that are linked to ozone concentrations that have emerged with proof that validate some of these beliefs. I've given a link to that paper, to the scientific experiments paper, in the description below. The first theory relates to the energy of, or the state of water as a base element. And the second one is the acidity or the alkalinity of water. The premise of number one, the first theory, is that when water is in a flowing state, it conducts and retains, for lack of a better word, memories or energy vibration. And the fundamental assumption is water is a good retainer of those characteristics, or as a memory of its own. So flowing water that is in a shaken state will be exposed to multiple characteristics that are dependent on the environment and the forces surrounding it. A simple example in our real world is the influence of gravitational forces on the waves, particularly on a full moon night. The same water has waves one day, and on the other day it is a very calm sea. Based on the gravitational pull, there is a change in the behavior of water. Therefore, we can conclusively say that energy impacts water, and during an eclipse, when there are energy changes happening linked to ozone concentrations, there has to be an impact as well for water bodies or anything contained in water. To scientifically measure the impact, researchers took a few bottles and stored water prior to an eclipse. And in each of the bottles, they planted seeds or saplings. Now what they did was, during the eclipse, they stirred the water in some of the bottles. Only in some, not in all. So there were few with static water that was stored before the eclipse, and there were few more where there was a continuous stirring happening during an eclipse. And as I said, each of them had a plant sapling in it. What the researchers found out is that in those bottles where they stirred the water and exposed to the rays during an eclipse, the sapling grew into a plant but with a stunted growth, while the saplings in the remaining bottles, kept safe from the rays of the eclipse, had a normal growth. Now link this belief of having a pregnant woman stay indoors during an eclipse and not being exposed to the rays. The fetus is cushioned in a bag of fluid. So exposing the pregnant mother to the eclipse could be thought as stirring that fluid and exposing the baby to the rays of the eclipse. Hence, for the normal growth of the baby, the mother is asked to restrict any rays from reaching the indoors of the room in which she is resting. I would emphasize that many of these beliefs may have well been a result of observations over thousands of years and not some holy verdict. But the rationale of protecting the baby based on the stunted plant experiments sounds logical. The other scientific aspect we look at is the pH level of water during an eclipse, or the acidity or alkalinity of water. What was shown is that the pH level of water decreases much before the eclipse starts, and it stays like that for some more time even after the eclipse ends, and then it comes back to normal. Similarly, the experiments proved that there is an ozone layer depletion occurring before the eclipse, during the eclipse, and after the eclipse. And then after some time, the ozone layer comes back to normal. So that ozone shield, for lack of a better word, is broken during the eclipse period. All this impacts the composition and characteristics of water and other elements of nature. Just based on the rays and energy, if water is undergoing changes, why not the food that we eat? This can explain why we are restricted from eating or storing food during an eclipse, and instead asked to cook them fresh once the eclipse is over and after the environmental characteristic return to a pre-eclipse state. This time duration of the change of characteristics was observed by our traditional masters of Hindu beliefs. This time duration was divided into components of a block or 1/8 of a day or 3 hours and called praharas. In the case of a lunar eclipse, the first cycle is 3 praharas or 9 hours before the eclipse, and then 3 hours after the eclipse, meaning 9 hours before and 3 hours after, the elements are undergoing changes and we are asked to follow the restrictions. In the case of a solar eclipse like October 14th, the time lag is even longer. 4 praharas or 12 hours prior and 3 hours after is the time it takes to wear off the restrictions. So the experiments and observations by our ancestors give an indication on the rationality of the restrictions. Avoiding eating before, during the eclipse, during and after, safeguarding a pregnant woman from the potential ill effects of the rays, symbolically allowing the body to balance out with elements of nature by taking a bath before and after the eclipse is over, and even in such cases allow the water in the pipe to flow for some time before using it. This is to wear away any impacts of stirring or the movements of water. Probably the same reason as to why it is recommended that after an eclipse you are asked to allow some water to go through the tap for some time before you start consuming. Now let's talk about the last and the fourth belief, that during an eclipse that you should do more charity or dana, offer more prayers or puja. This has no relevance or foundational directive from the Gita or the Upanishad. There are no periods where you have to do more or less prayers or charity, because adhyatma or spirituality is beyond space-time geometry. You're always in the mode of divine connectivity. Or for the believers in Krishna, you're always connected to the Krishna Wi-Fi. You're always in Nitya Yukta or continually situated in the divine consciousness or divine thinking. An eclipse does not bring about any special circumstance to change that pattern. So in conclusion, the beliefs of the Hindu tradition appear to have some practical validity, and more importantly, not overly be intrusive in one's life. If any, they take a more conservative view to avoid any unknown side effects. Like anything else, we should use our intellect and, depending on the context, follow the situation and make changes and make the decision on what to follow, what not to follow, and of course your personal beliefs. Very important that eclipse is not a particular event where you need to do more of prayers or less of puja or more of charity or less of charity. That has to be your default mode where you're always connected to the divine and always connected to the Wi-Fi of divine consciousness. Before I close, I would just make a request. If you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe to this channel so that you can continue to receive many more videos like this on a weekly basis. Thank you. Enjoy the inquiry of truth. Enjoy your spiritual journey. I will talk to you soon.